Horror in the 1940s largely focused on the horror that surrounds and the horror we become. Films like The Wolfman and Cat People showed a person being scared of themselves. In The Wolfman, Larry Talbot becomes fearful of what he is becoming after being bitten by a wolf. In Cat People, Irina Dombrovna is scared that she will turn into a panther once she becomes intimate. The fears here are more personal and have less to do with what is on the outside and more to do with what is on the inside. In The Spiral Staircase, released on February 6, 1946, the fear largely focuses on the main character's inability to seek help once she becomes the target of a serial killer who is killing disabled women. Helen doesn't just have to run and fight for her life, she has to fight the trauma that has caused her to go mute in order to get the help that she and the other people in the house need. In today's video, we are discussing The Spiral Staircase, a psychological horror film that has become the focus of film criticisms over the years and has been referred to as a progenitor to the contemporary slasher. From the stalking killer to the final girl, to the gothic elements, we will break down the movie and discuss the character of Helen and world that surrounds her. Hello and welcome to the Quiet Riot, where we talk film, television, and media. I'm Ainsley, and today we are discussing The Spiral Staircase. This is a film that I've recently discovered thanks to the vast amounts of older movies that are now out there with the various streaming services. This was post watching the film Night Watch in preparation for my last video on this channel, and I came across it, found it interesting, and I'm so glad that I decided to watch it. It is quickly becoming one of my favorites, and it's really interesting to kind of go and see these different reviews and the reviews that have popped up over the years and really get to hear different people's interpretations of it, as well as what other people just get from it by viewing it. There is going to be quite a few spoilers going through it. I will start with a section that is mostly spoiler-free, but I do want to forewarn you. If you want to watch this movie, it is available on various streaming services, some for free, all of which will be put in the description box below. In 1906 Vermont, 3 disabled women have become the target of a serial killer, and mute Helen has become his next target. The film has a gothic atmosphere with elements of film noir, and there are several occurrences that have made the film a precursor to the slasher subgenre. Helen is a housemaid living in New England mansion where she helps care for an ailing woman. Helen, portrayed by Dorothy McGuire, fits perfectly into the final girl trope. She is stalked by a mostly unseen figure, and like Scream, there is a rotating list of suspects. The Spiral Staircase has a gothic atmosphere with film noir elements. Reflections, close-ups, and high emotions add to the film's tension. Set over the course of one night, as those living and working in the house go about their business, the killer stalks the halls, and he has his sights on the vulnerable Helen. Before we go any further, I do want to discuss mutism. I am not mute, of course, nor have I ever been mute, experienced mutism. So I did want to make sure that I look it up and treat the character of Helen with respect, as well as other people who may be mute or have experienced mutism and just disability in general. According to the Oxford Dictionary, mutism is the inability to speak, typically as a result of congenital deafness or brain damage. Unwillingness or refusal to speak arising from psychological causes such as depression or trauma. According to the NHS, selective mutism is an anxiety disorder where a person is unable to speak in certain social situations, such as with classmates at school or to relatives they do not see very often. It usually starts during childhood and, if left untreated, can persist into adulthood. According to goodtherapy.org, psychogenic mutism is a mutism caused by a number of conditions including deafness, speech delays, and developmental disabilities. But psychogenic mutism occurs when someone, usually a child who is capable of speaking, stops speaking. The character of Helen has mutism based on a traumatizing event that she experienced prior to the events of the film. So for her, a lot of her life is dealing with being mute and not having experienced mutism and not having had it for a very big portion of her life, and so she's both adjusting to that, and in the time that this is set, the early 1900s, there wasn't a lot of understanding of mutism, and there are a lot of new things coming into play in the psychiatric world and a slight better understanding. So that comes into, trying to overcome it and change it. But I think here it's best not to use the words change, because when it comes to disabilities, there's this need to change, and by extension change the person, and one that should always, especially when a person is able to truly speak up for themselves and give consent at a certain age, that begins to be able to be like, I don't want to do this, or I'm not ready to do this yet, then they can say, I don't want this change, because someone can, they can say or not whether they want a prosthetic if they may be an amputee, or they can say, I want a specific type of hearing aid or this surgery. Those are just some things that I wanted to break up, because we are dealing with a disability here, and the way films often deal with disability, especially in the earlier days, it wasn't done very well, and it wasn't given a lot of thought when it came to the people that they were portraying. The Spiral Staircase maintains a lot of levity, with couple Mr. and Mrs. Oates always managing to make a quip or do something that is at opposites with the overall tone of the film. Melodramatic in parts, the movie certainly was of its time in some ways, but also managed to stand out for the more toxic behaviors it notices in its characters. I was really surprised by a good portion of the narrative that comes through with specific people and specific relationships, and the recognition that this is not really the way that you should be talking or seeing things. Like, if you're a man and you're saying these specific things to a woman, or if this is really the way that men are viewing women, that's wrong. And that's not really something that you saw a lot at that specific time, and there's still, in film and television, a lack of recognition in certain things, so it's great to see that, and to see that done earlier, and there's a lot more respect given to the female characters as well as to Helen and her disability. If you were worried that Helen is portrayed as weak and unable to take care of herself, don't worry. Helen may have a disability, but she is able to spring into action. Without giving too much away, I will say that Helen overcomes what others see as her weakness, and proves that she is capable of taking care of herself. It is easy to see certain parts of this film as others trying to change her or fix her, but I think that it is part of the acknowledgement that Helen is able to take care of herself, and even if her disability is temporary, that her being mute does not make her any less worthy. Again, if you would like to watch this film before getting too spoiled, I highly recommend checking it out here on YouTube or on other streaming services. All will be left in the description box below, along with my personal websites and some articles that I used in my research for this video. In 1906 Vermont, Helen attends a silent film screening in the parlor at a local inn. While the film is playing, a paraplegic woman who is staying at the inn is murdered in her room. She is the third woman with a disability to be killed. The new doctor in town, Dr. Perry, takes mute Helen partway home before he is called away. She decides to walk the rest of the way home in rural Vermont to the mansion where she works. While she gets closer to home, a man is watching her. The killer has her in his sights, and she just may be the next victim. A moment that really stood out to me and showed how this film is in fact a precursor to the contemporary slasher is that beginning. This is outside of the home, which becomes our main setting for the film, and it does not take really a look back in the past, but there is some past events that play a really big role in this movie, similar to a lot of other horror films, particularly slasher films. That's become a very popular trope in slasher films. We think of Halloween with Michael Myers killing his sister, and then we have something like Scream, where Casey Becker is the first one to be killed, or she's technically the second one to be killed. Her boyfriend is the first. But there are also things that occurred before the film even started that becomes a part of our main character, our final girl's story, as the killing of Maureen Prescott is a big part of Sidney Prescott's story and also plays into the killer's story. I think it's very interesting to take a look at this movie and maybe take a look at a lot of other movies that have become an inspiration to others within the horror and thriller genres, and really see how these different things have continued to inspire various films over time, and how it's really given inspiration to a lot of the tropes that are very popular in the genre and the subgenre. In the film, while the killer strangles the first victim off screen, we do see her hands as she attempts to put on a dress and is then attacked by the killer. While in the theater, again, we hear the attack occur. I think this movie did a really good job at utilizing what they had at their disposal and what they were able to do while dealing with the specific rating system that they were using. Of course, there were certain things that they couldn't do or show, and you had the Hays Code going on, and they really did a good job at playing around that, and I think that added to the overall atmosphere that this movie had going for it. The film allows for a lot of dark humor and recognizes it as that. The new in-town Dr. Perry says to the town's doctor upon coming to the scene of the first crime,
"She was just in my office last week."
Did she pay her bill? Or was this her way of getting out of it?
I haven't enough experience to make that sort of joke.
Perhaps not, Dr. Perry.
Due to the time period, there was only so much they could show, and it also kept the killer under wraps that they used certain techniques such as the close-up of the eye, and the close-up of the eye was actually that of the director. What little we see actually helps the film be more of a psychological horror film more than a grisly one. The scene where Helen returns home reminds me of the Wolfman as the killer stalks her. The atmosphere at this beginning is very foggy, and this adds to the overall gothic atmosphere that this film has. It also takes place in a early 19th century New England mansion, and that's where it spends the majority of its time, and everything takes over the course of one night, which honestly adds to that suspense. A point that stood out to me is when Mr. Oates is talking to Helen.
Look at it this way, Helen. Murder's like a $1 million lottery. Sure it is, listen. You pick up the newspaper. You see someone's picture who's won $1 million. You pick up another paper. There's a picture of someone who's been murdered. There's never me. There's never you. It's always somebody else, isn't it?
It makes me think of something that you often hear in both horror and mystery as well as true crime, when someone says this kind of thing doesn't happen in a place like this kind of thing doesn't happen here. And we hear this on the news when people are giving interviews. It seems so on the nose of people not really recognizing it, that stuff like this can truly happen anywhere. As Mrs. Warren gets more sick, they find that her meds are missing. Albert, the oldest son, and Mrs. Oates go to get a bottle of brandy. Mrs. Oates takes one of her own. This, as well as some things that are going to happen or that happen directly after it, are a precursor or that are a catalyst for what is more to come in terms of the killer versus Helen. So Helen at this point becomes a lot more isolated thanks to certain maneuverings and just coincidences that are going on in the house. Mrs. Warren, who Helen works for, she's the matriarch of the house, and she is very ill, and she's actually played by Ethel Barrymore, who is part of the famous Barrymore family. Eventually, as the doctor leaves because he is called away, and Mr. Oates leaves to get more medicine that's far away, things get worse. Albert's secretary Blanche is murdered, and Helen finds her body. She believes that it is Stephen, the younger brother and the biological son to Mrs. Oates, or the biological son to Mrs. Warren, and that he is the one who killed her because they are seeing each other. And she ends up locking him in the room and runs to Albert, the oldest son and stepson of Mrs. Warren, who begins to show his true colors. Throughout this entirety of the film, he seems like he's a lot more put together, and overall that he's a lot more put together and stoic, and he's just got his life together, but apparently that's not the case. Albert's motives are that he believes that essentially those that are disabled or those that maybe have any kind of something on the outside or inside, anything that essentially makes them different, illness or otherwise, that they shouldn't be here. They are imperfect. And this is something that occurred in various serious moments in history, Holocaust, things that happened before it, things that have happened after it. We obviously see it today, especially in the US, with certain situations regarding insurance and medicine. And it's tragic because while this specific film is making commentary on the events that are occurring inside of it, I think it really goes to show this movie was made and released in 1946. We like to pretend that they're not constantly a part of the narrative that's happening in the world, but there always seems to be someone who is either committing or calling for genocide. It is happening in the US as we speak in regards to the queer community, specifically the trans community, and with the way the medical system here is here in the US, that is also an act of genocide. And there's the genocide or the acts of one occurring when we expect people who are of lower working class and live in poverty to not have children. We are essentially wanting only a certain class of people to live in this country or to live in this world, and this film really speaks to that, and the committing of or calling for genocides, and that is definitely a very deep way to go, and that's very specific. But I think, someone had said that this film is an allegory for going from silent films into sound films, which it can be for sure, but I think the film itself is pretty on the nose of who Albert stands for, the type of person that Albert stands for, and that he is, and it's very on the nose. Albert is officially killed by Mrs. Warren as he attempts to kill Helen. Helen goes to call for help and is eventually able to speak. Though this is not super clear, she is working through some stuff, so she's still got so much more to do, and at the end of the day, the trauma that has caused her mutism is always going to be something that is present. Some disabilities can be overcome, can be worked through. There are disabilities that can't be, and there's always this idea of someone needing to be fixed. I know that autism is one of those, and a lot of people who do not have disabilities or do not have a specific disability are constantly trying to fix something, and they don't recognize the true harm that they are doing. I think some people do and some people don't. Of course, in the terms of Albert, he is the personification of the evil trying to fix the world in the way that he sees fit. And so, to me, this film is not only a precursor to the slasher, it is also a good example of showing that you may find that getting rid of something is essentially fixing your state, your country, your world, but in reality, you're just the evil person being encroaching on these people's lives. I like that Helen talking on the phone is not this perfect, clear way of speaking, because a lot of the times in films, still to this day, something is just a little too clean, a little too perfect. So we know that there's still things that she maybe needs help with, but the bigger part is her recognizing the importance of her voice. And I know that at the end of the day, whether somebody is speaking outwardly or maybe they are using sign language, writing something down, whatever that is, your voice matters. And watching this movie, I just felt there was so much to really seep through and look through and think about and discuss. And I really enjoyed watching the movie, and I really enjoyed researching and talking about the movie and coming up with my own thoughts and ideas as to what this movie is truly about. To me, this movie is about people who have disabilities have a right to live, and they have a right to live freely. And whether that is something that the author of the original book meant for, or the writer and director of this movie meant for, I think that this movie is just showcasing the power that someone has, or that having a disability may make things difficult, but as a human being, you have the right to life and power and not have that taken away from you from someone like Albert, or someone who's maybe being a little bit more using politics or whatever to do it. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch or listen to this video. I really do appreciate it. And if you've seen this movie or you've just seen this video, I would really like to know your thoughts on that and your thoughts or feelings towards the use of disability in films, horror, or otherwise. I would also like to know your thoughts on how horror can be used to discuss more difficult subjects, or thrillers or suspense, because things can really go a lot deeper than what they may appear on the surface, or even a few layers down. I do think that this film, whether intentional or not, is a lot deeper than it may originally seem, and I would just love to know your thoughts in the comments below. If you have any movies you would like me to watch and review, and just generally share me review or just talk about in any way on this channel, please let me know in the comments. I would really love to hear from you. Or if you would like anything you'd like to discuss, I would love to have more of a discussion about this movie or others in the comments below. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time. Bye!